Good morning. Good to be with you and also with those who are with us online as well. What a wonderful reminder of God's promise. That God continues to fight for each and every one of us. It's in that promise that we gather together as a community of faith this morning as we continue in our series, Walk the Talk. Meet Peter Britt. Peter was born in a small village in Switzerland in 1819, and he later immigrated to America in 1845 with his father, his brother, and his brother's family because conditions in that small Swiss village were not good for raising a family. They settled on a farm near Highland, Illinois when they immigrated over here to the United States, and many Brits still live there today. But it was in 1852 that Peter got gold fever. And so he decided to move his way west, eventually settling in Jacksonville, Oregon. Peter became known after some time as the town's photographer, eventually becoming known as one of the Pacific Northwest's most celebrated photographers. He's known to have taken the first successful image, if you've heard of Crater Lake. He's taken the first successful image of Crater Lake, and later images that he produced were used in a campaign to create Crater Lake National Park in 1902. Peter also became known through other interests and pursuits. He established a vineyard, and he planted orchards of peaches and pears. And in retirement, these pursuits took on a whole new meaning as he successfully cultivated palms and banana plants, jasmine and magnolias, oranges and ginkgo trees. He became known as the father of the Southern Oregon fruit industry. Peter's legacy is still evident in Jackson County. His Pioneer Valley View Vineyard is a namesake of a contemporary local winery that was established in 1972. The annual Peter Britt Music Festival, if you've ever heard of it started back in 1963 on the grounds of the Britt home, continues to this day to attract musicians from all over the world. And the sequoia redwood tree that Peter Britt planted in 1862 to commemorate the birth of his son Emil still dominates that landscape. Meet Peter Britt, my great uncle on my mother's side. I have to always make sure I say that. I don't know if you do, but I love hearing stories of my ancestors. Those who came to this country, made a life for themselves, and contributed to the welfare of the communities in which they were planted. Now, of course, I could have chosen another great uncle on my father's side, Charlie Bird. His contribution to our great land was a little different than that of Uncle Peter. Uncle Charlie had a more wild and rebellious side to him, known to have run with the infamous Dalton Gang at one point in his life. I'm not sure how many bank robberies and train robberies he was a part of, or even if he was a part of any of them at all. But I'm sure that our Bird ancestors, who immigrated from England to the United States decades before we were an independent country, they probably wouldn't look too kindly on some of Uncle Charlie's life decisions. So we don't have a picture of Uncle Charlie this morning. As we wrap up our Walk the Talk message series, these stories were important for me to remember as I reflect upon how I, as a follower of Jesus, am called to respond to the very hot topic issue of immigration. The reality is we can all trace our ancestral history beyond the borders of the United States of America. Most of us would not be here if someone from our family had not taken the risk to make that journey, to make that first step. I say most of us because our African American brothers and sisters who can trace their heritage back to those who were part of the slave trade, they were forced. They didn't make that choice to come here. But most of our ancestors made that choice to come. Even more recent studies show that even our Native American sisters and brothers can trace their ancestry beyond the borders of the United States, all the way to Northeast Asia. Around 23,000 years ago, a group crossed the Bering Land Bridge between Northeast Asia and modern-day Alaska, eventually making their way to the rest of the Americas, settling here about 13,000 years ago. At some point in our ancestral story, we have all been strangers in a foreign land, some more recently than others. I think we all know that immigration is a very layered and complex issue. It's one that brings about vitriol and arguments all the time, whether it's on Facebook and social media or in the circles in which we travel. But it's an issue that has not been a stranger in the public square since the birth of our nation. And there are patterns that we have seen throughout our history. Unfortunately, even knowing our history, we have been doomed to repeat it. Let me give you 3 examples.
This is a very, very long introduction. We're 6 minutes into the message. The topic is being very well laid. It's wildly unclear where he's going to go with this. We haven't talked about any scripture yet. Like, he's obviously talking about the issue, but where's he going with this? He hasn't gotten into the meat yet, and this is a very, very long introduction. Now, it's a short message. It's only a 27-minute message. So he's building up to something. I'm very curious to see what he's building up to, but he's just spending a really long time doing it.
Let me give you 3 examples. Take, for instance, the Irish community in the mid-19th century. They were leaving Ireland because of a great famine, and they were coming over to America for a better life. And many perished along the way. But those who survived that journey were uneducated, typically lower class, but they were willing to do the work that other people weren't willing to do. And namely, in that place, it was building the sewer systems in New York and in the northeastern part of the United States. But people were nervous about them. People were fearful of them. And out of that nervousness and out of that fear, they were called names that diminished their dignity. And there was even a thought by some that the Irish coming to America was actually a plot by the Pope to have Catholics take over America. And that fear became so big that a political party was formed called the Native American Party. Not Native American in the ways in which we now consider it and understand it and define it, but it was a party of those who were born, at least within the last century, in America. And the main purpose and the main agenda of this particular political party was to ensure that no Catholics got elected to government positions. Because if that happened, that was the step towards taking over our country. Unless our history books kept it out, I don't think that fear came to fruition. Then there was the Chinese who were fleeing China because of the oppressive regime in the mid to late 1800s. And when they arrived on our shores, originally they were welcomed with open arms, even though there was some trepidation about them coming over. But because they worked hard and they were willing to do the jobs that nobody else was willing to do, mainly at this point, building the American railroad system, they were tolerated. And when the railroads were finished, people didn't find value in them as they once had. So as a result, there was a time in the 1880s known as the Yellow Peril, when there was this great fear of Chinese. And in 1882, an act was passed called the Chinese Exclusion Act, where Chinese were not allowed to come to America anymore unless there was some extenuating circumstance. And that law stayed in effect for 60 years.
So he has spent a lot of time setting the stage for something, and I still don't know for what. Like, he's been making a lot of very political statements, which can be okay in a sermon, but that is all he has been doing for 8 minutes. There's been so little to criticize because I don't know when the sermon is going to start. It sounds like he's making this sounds more like a campaign speech from a political party than it does a sermon. When is the sermon going to start?
Years. Fast forward to the 1920s. And it wasn't the Irish, it wasn't the Chinese. This time it was the Russians. And many Russians, they were fleeing the Bolshevik Revolution, and this became known as the Red Scare. And the fear was this, that in the midst of that flood of immigrants that were coming over, in the midst of all of them would be some Bolsheviks that would use that opportunity to turn America into a Soviet state. And so there became growing fear, not only about those who were coming from Russia, but then eventually those from Eastern Europe, and then those from Southern Europe. And this group of immigrants was called the undesirables. Just that name in and of itself. The undesirables. And as a result, we have the Immigration Act of 1924. And that was created to limit undesirables from entering our country. And those undesirables included people like Greeks and Italians, Spaniards, Czechs, Jews, those from Ukraine and those from Russia. And the last I checked, we aren't a Soviet state. We have a history in our country of xenophobia. And we actually have a history as humanity of xenophobia. Xenophobia is the fear of strangers, and it continues to be repeated today. And with that fear, what we do is we begin to assume the worst about those who are not like us. And we begin to paint these broad strokes about who people are, and we use harsh rhetoric and language to describe and talk about the people who are living and working among us. And no matter where you come out on immigration reform, does that sound like something that a follower of Jesus would do?
Okay, this is tripping over from monotonous and confusing into the space of being dangerous. It's 10 minutes into a 30-minute message. We haven't opened the Bible at all, and he's making broad sweeping claims without any scriptural support. I'm very interested. I hope that immediately after this, he starts opening the Bible and starts talking about how what he's saying is grounded in something, and it starts actually making claims. Instead, he is just taking a bunch of fears, which may or may not have been well-founded, which may or may not have actually protected us from things at one point or another, and saying all of these fears are invalid. So, like, there's potential for something good to be said here, but this is terribly dangerous to say. Does this sound like something that Christians should be? That is making an appeal to people's sensibilities as opposed to making an appeal to truth. That's dangerous. This message is starting to get terrifying.
Follower of Jesus would do. Does that sound like something that Jesus himself would do? Throughout this message series, I've encouraged you to center yourself on the voice of the one we follow. We all know we have a lot of different voices that are speaking into our lives, but to focus yourself on the voice of Jesus. I've been inviting you to give yourself permission to wrestle with his teachings, allowing those teachings to guide you to a better understanding of what a just and compassionate responses might look like in the face of all of the issues that we face together today. We talked about mental health, violence, and now immigration. And as we finish our series, I invite you to deeply consider the last question that's in your message notes. I'm jumping ahead just a little bit, but I want to bring your attention to it right now. And that is, how is God calling you to walk the talk? In what ways is God inviting you to take that next step, to put into action what you say with your mouth you believe? And so maybe it's taking some notes as we continue together this morning. Maybe it's writing down some notes as you leave and continue to reflect on it later on today or throughout this week. And it might not have anything to do with immigration or mental health or violence. It might just have to do with, how is God calling you to put into action your faith, to live it before others? Now, regarding our last topic of immigration, one of the teachings that can help guide us is from the Gospel of Matthew, the 25th chapter, verses 38 through 40. Now, I want to be clear that the Bible is not to be used as a public policy manual. That's not its use. The Bible is a story about this journey that God has with the people that God loves. A journey where at times the people are out of step with God, and at other times they are in step with God. You see, when Jesus teaches, he's inviting us into a relationship that is in step with God and with each other. And so a few chapters before the reading that I'm about to share, we hear Jesus teach the two greatest commandments. Do you remember them? What are they? To love God and to love your neighbor, each other. Correct. Two commandments that are inextricably tied together. And it's these words that help to frame the context of verses 38 through 40. And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you? And the king will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. In other words, if we fail to act out of love for those who are hungry or naked or imprisoned or are a stranger, then we have failed to show love for God. Throughout the scriptures, the Bible has over 150 references to the stranger. It's interpreted in different ways as stranger or foreigner or alien, but over 150 references. And it is full of how God calls us to respond to those who are different from us. And he calls us not to respond in fear, but to respond in love. Now, our daily scripture readings that are in our bulletins every single week, they give some more passages to reflect upon throughout this week. And so I want to encourage you to read them. Or maybe you can follow them on Facebook because we put them up every single day. But to invite God to speak to you through them. What is God telling you about God's heart for those who are strangers among us? Rabbi Ratzin offered some powerful insight when he said, when we read the Bible, immigration is all the buzz. However, the talk is quite different. It's never about legality or illegality. It is never about walls or protection. It isn't about the quality of our defenses. It's about the quality of individual lives. It doesn't begin with policy. It begins with humanity.
Since there wasn't much to deal with at the beginning of the message, because I couldn't tell where in the world he's going, I'm going to take this opportunity to nitpick the smallest things. That statement is garbage. Jesus does talk about policy in some instances. Sometimes he does start with policy. Just off the top of my head, he who is without sin, cast the first stone. So, just these small little statements given without care that don't have any support or basis in Scripture. This pastor is losing connection with things that are important. Like, he's losing connection with the most important things, and he's kind of delving into nonsense. And he's also not making a strong connection with people's lives.
With humanity. And that's where Jesus begins in our Bible passage this morning. That's where Jesus always begins.
What on earth is he talking about? This makes no sense.
Begins. To maybe help us see this in a little bit different way, the great theologian Martin Buber once offers us a way to think about how we are in relationship with one another. And so he has two ways. One of those ways is what he calls the I-it relationship. I-it. The I-it relationship. Now, these relationships are transactional in nature. We all do them. So it's, what benefit are you to me? Or maybe in our immigration conversation or any other kind of hot issue conversation, it might sound more like what's best for our economy or what's best for our jobs as a country, or do we need to be paying attention to security? How does it affect our security? Those are transactional in nature. That's the I-it. But then he says there's another way, and that is through the I thou relationships. And these relationships are grounded in the human perspective.
Okay, this makes no sense on the face of it. So if you're talking about, like, just to take an example of, so all of the things that he mentioned in his discussion of transactional statements are values. Security is a value. Security has a value. Safety has a value. It is a worthwhile value, especially for a politician or a public figure to take into account when he's deciding policy. So, to say that those are transactional, and when he's talking about, and by conversely, we're now going to start talking about values, he has taken all of the things that he just mentioned in the transactional statement and said these aren't values, which makes no sense. They are valuable.
In the human perspective, concerning ourselves with people and values first.
So this message is very strange, and there's something terribly wrong with it. So it starts off talking about policy for about 10 minutes on a 30-minute message and insinuating that this policy is bad. Like, so just to take an example, he's talking about the Bolshevik scare. That was a reasonable fear. We were dealing with a nation who was clearly demonstrating, both in their own writings and apparently to the rest of the world, that they would do anything, absolutely anything, to undermine their opponents. They were throwing morality out the window. And in a culture like the United States, which is inherently open, it is reasonable for those who are charged with our protection to become worried about the fact that we were vulnerable to infiltration because of how open our culture is, because of how much power we give to people, to the normal everyday person. Any single person can vote. It is completely understandable that such an open culture would be vulnerable to infiltration by actors who have poor intentions, actors who want to hurt us and to influence our policy towards our opponents. That is a fairly natural fear to have, especially for those who are charged with our protection. So he's taking that and vaguely insinuating that that is bad. That is not the policy of the average individual. Like, there's some strained validity to the point that he's making, in that we should love our neighbor and love the stranger, like that we should care for the stranger and we should treat the stranger with respect. But largely speaking, especially in the culture of the United States, we do that. It is outside the norm for somebody to treat a foreigner disrespectfully. That is unusual in the United States. The United States is terribly xenophilic, which is a strength and a weakness. It is normal for some of our watchdogs to make sure that our xenophilia is tempered with some degree of patriotism and nationalism. That all being said, this is not the purview of a sermon. The sermon started, and it's so loosely and tenuously related to the introduction. He's done a terrible job building a fortress of ideas around his sermon. He's built a fortress of ideas around one thing, and he's talking about biblical principles that are related to something that is not related. He's drawing a false parallel between two things, and the parallels are not something that's terribly close to people's lives. These scares are over. The yellow scare, the red scare, these scares are over. They've been over for decades. This is not something closely connected with anybody's life. This sermon is going terribly off the rails.
Values first. And Martin Buber says that these relationships are infused with holiness. So as followers of Jesus, when we talk about immigration or any other issue, those are the transactional questions. The I-it relationships typically are first on our lips. That's what we're typically arguing about and talking about. But what Martin Buber is trying to invite us into, and I believe what Jesus is constantly inviting us into, is to see that those I-it relationships need to be secondary. We always begin with human beings, created in God's image. And Jesus' teachings are very clear about this. Our view of society, our view of the kingdom to come begins with how we are in relationship with God and with one another. And it's only when we begin with the human being, the I-thou relationship, can we then create policies that reflect our values, that are compassionate, that are just, and that reflect our faith. Another example of the I-thou relationship is found in the Old Testament book of Leviticus, 19th chapter, verses 33 through 34, where it says, "Do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself." Didn't we just hear that? You see the connection there. "Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." God is reminding the Israelites that their story is an immigrant story that must not be forgotten, just as our stories are immigrant stories that must not be forgotten. That by remembering our stories, we are able to more compassionately listen and understand the stories of others who find themselves in those situations, those same situations. Now, God is not telling the Israelites the kinds of laws that they are supposed to have for the people that are coming and going from their lands.
There's a strange association and assumption between immigrants and foreigners and those in need. Yeah, those are commonly associated, but it's still a strange one. He hasn't actually made that connection.
People that are coming and going from their lands. You see, what was going on during the ancient Middle East, what was common during that time, was that the immigrants were not given any rights or status as citizens in any other country. That was kind of the law of the land. But God shares with the Israelites a new kind of law by which to abide. And in that, it demonstrates God's heart towards people who are immigrants, strangers, foreigners, that they are to be treated with love, respect, and welcomed with dignity, because the measure of a society is how it cares for those who are in need.
What is he talking about? This message makes no sense.
Need. And the way that we can begin to do that, I believe, is not by passing laws and policy first, but by first listening to the stories of the immigrants that are among us.
This pastor opened the Bible to Leviticus and described a policy, and then made the statement, this passage of Scripture is not describing the kinds of laws that are supposed to govern the coming and going. What? Are you insane?
That are among us. As some of you know, we have a connection with an organization here called Casa de Paz, and it's located in Aurora. And they provide love, support, and resources to those who have been detained in the Aurora ICE Detention Center. And through Casa de Paz, you can visit with somebody who is either currently detained or has been released. You can hear their story. You can begin to see them through the eyes of Jesus. That's one way in which you can hear someone's story. And if you're interested in that, you can go ahead and write that down on a connection card, take it on over to the Welcome Center. Reed will make sure that I get that. Come and talk to me after worship. We can make sure that you get connected. Or maybe it's volunteering with our English as a second language ministry that happens here every single week. Connecting with Kathy Case on how you can be a part of hearing those stories and being a part of those conversations. Or maybe if that's not kind of down your alley, or those are things that you cannot do, there's one thing that we can all do. And then we can all go back home and we can Google immigrant stories. And there are plenty of videos that will open your eyes to see and hear the stories of the people who are behind the issue. I believe that by changing the conversation from being a policy issue to a human one, that we can begin to work together towards more just and compassionate laws for the strangers, the foreigners, the aliens in our midst. I'm inviting you this week to put the politics aside, the I-it transactional relationship, and again wrestle with this issue in light of our faith. Maybe it's in doing it together as small groups, or with your partner in life, or with your family. Inviting God to give you a heart to first see all immigrants, documented, undocumented, does not matter, as beloved children of God. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but right out here in our lobby, right on the brick wall, we have a collage that was created at an Ash Wednesday worship service in 2016 by Mark Fraley. A picture of it up on the screen here. And this collage is titled Gifts of Love. And everyone at the worship service was invited to write on a piece of paper the ways in which they give and receive love in their life. And each of those slips of paper are the backdrop to the collage that you see. And upon these pieces of paper, as you can tell, is drawn an image of a family. And that family and that image is described by Mark in this way. He says, most of us have heard about or seen pictures depicting the terrible plight of refugees. Remember, this was in 2016. We had the Syrian refugee crisis that was going on. Escaping war-torn lands at great risk for their lives. I was shaken inside to see such outward and obvious signs of suffering. I have a wife and 3 children. Could I do what they were doing? Would I survive in those conditions? Could I walk from daylight until night, not knowing where food would come from or where my bed would be found? I imagine what Jesus would do. Seeing the blistered and torn up feet of these people, how he would lower himself to touch and care for his children. Washing one another's feet takes on another meaning when we think of those who travel as they have. Also, would I be able to respond to those who have already rejected my family just because of where I come from, what language I use, or what I look like? He goes on to say in this particular image, this family is functioning essentially through love. The son is upholding his father, doing his best to be big and strong, ready for whatever comes. The father is bent over, kissing his wife, grasping her with a tender but anchored hold. His wife is in the center, both receiving and giving her love, while she holds tightly on to her daughter, who now is fully abandoned to her mother's embrace. The mother is the key figure, holds the family unit together. This interlocked, weaved together image of love is one, he says, that resonates with me so deeply. Friends, this is one of the ways that it looks like to connect with the stories of those whom God has called us to welcome, care for, and love. It starts with the I, thou. It starts with humanity. I'd like to close with this thought from Roger McCrummon. Roger is an immigration lawyer with a Master's of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary.
Is this message about immigration policy and law or not? If it is, why did you spend so much time in the middle of the sermon downplaying the role of law in how Christians should think about this? And if it is not about law, why are we hearing from a immigration law professor? Or immigration lawyer?
Theological Seminary. And he says the church needs to be, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., the conscience of the nation. I encourage the church to not get co-opted into thinking they have to belong in one camp or the other, but they need to be the conscience of the nation. That when the nation acts outrageously out of fear, the church ought to say, we're not a part of that. That's how we break the patterns and the cycles. May it be so. Will you pray with me?
This message was terrible. It was egregious. This was awful. So, we live in a generation that is constantly indicted for the sins of their fathers, which the Bible specifically talks against. because you can't do anything about the evils of your fathers. There's plenty of space to talk about xenophobia and the dangers involved with that. And there's a great Christian point to be made about how you treat the other. But he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. He's trying to say he's not talking about policy, but making a lot of insinuations about what is bad policy and trying to make the audience feel bad about that. So this is bordering on guilt-mongering. This is not making its point well. This is not connecting to people's real lives in any meaningful way. Like, this message is bad. This message is really bad. He built a fortress of idea around policy and then tried to claim that the message was not around policy. It was confusing at best, and at worst, it was just trying to make people feel bad about stuff that they can't control. This message was at best, this message was a waste of time. At worst, this message leads people astray on how to think about this issue. He's mixing two things that are not very good to mix, which is immigration policy and how individuals treat immigrants. There's a lot of good space to make a sermon on how individuals treat immigrants. But policy is complicated, and he treated it with oversimplified kid gloves. This is a terrible message.